Okay, I've been researching the Roswell incident for about a dozen years now, or maybe 15 years. And what I'm best known for is analyzing a photograph of a telegram, a military telegram that was in the hands of General Roger Ramey. And this is right in the midst of the Roswell incident. And what happened is the base in Roswell put out a press release that they'd recovered a flying saucer, and that they were flying the pieces or whatever it was to Fort Worth, Texas, to see General Ramey. And then about an hour after the press release, General Ramey is saying, "Oh, it looks to me like it's a weather balloon." So that was his basic story. And then an hour later, he brought in a photographer from the local newspaper, and photographs were taken. And you can see in all the photographs, he's holding this slip of paper, but in one, the photographer, just by chance, happened to get an angle on the front of the paper, and that's what's called the Ramey Memo. And we've long wondered what might be on it, and there's speculation that it was a new press release about weather balloons. But starting about a dozen years ago, the photographer assembled a team, and they started to take a look at it, and they got blow-ups. And one of the words they picked out of there was victims, and that got a lot of people like me interested in it, and then we started looking at it. And now we have a pretty good idea of what's in that memo. And basically what it is General Ramey is communicating with the Pentagon to General Hoyt Vandenberg, who's the acting chief of staff there for the Army Air Force. And he's informing him as to what's happening and what they're planning. So what's happening is he says that they found a disc, okay, which he may also describe as being a pod or an airfoil. It's a little unclear. And the victims of the wreck, that you, meaning Vandenberg, had forwarded to Fort Worth, Texas, possibly to some team there. And then there's the next paragraph, okay, that's what's happening. This is what we're doing about it. Well, they have the bodies. How are they getting them to Fort Worth? Well, they're flying them out. And maybe a C-47, maybe a B-29. We know of a B-29 flight the next day. We have the testimony of the crew and one of the people who was guarding, the loading of of this large crate into this box. And the crew said they got to Fort Worth, and it was greeted by a mortician because one of the crew members knew the guy and knew he was a mortician. So that was, and it was surrounded by an armed guard and chained into this B-29. So they all thought that was very peculiar. Plus they knew about the rumors of the crashed saucer and the little men, that had been recovered outside of town. So I think the memo is talking about this flight the next day. They were still planning it. They didn't know how they were going to do it. So it says aviators in the disc. I think it says aviators. They will ship, and I think it says to the flight surgeon at Fort Worth. And then they were going to ship them by C-47 or B-29. And then the next, I think, is talking about, okay, that's the bodies. What are they doing with the craft that they recovered? Well, I think it says that Wright Field, which is in Dayton, Ohio, where they had the aeronautical labs, they were going to assess this object at Roswell. And it has the words "at Roswell" in there. And then next it starts talking about, okay, now this is how we're going to cover it up. This is how we're going to deal with it publicly. So at first it says perhaps about noon, a counterintelligence team at Roswell, and we have witnesses there say there are all these strange Army counterintelligence guys running around. This counterintelligence team said to send out what they called the misstate meaning of story, which we think is referring to the press release. In other words, they were giving part of the story, a little bit of truth, but they weren't telling the whole story of what was going on. And the press release said we recovered a flying disc, but didn't say what it was, didn't say exactly where, didn't say anything about bodies or a disc or whatever. So that's the misstate meaning of the story. And then they said, and they think that the next press release of weather balloons, which was the news story that Ramey was putting out, would work better if they add photos of weather balloons, which Ramey was doing at right that moment, and then do balloon demonstrations afterwards. Okay, so, and then I've been able to document a whole number of military balloon demonstrations that followed in the next few days. In fact, they were openly bragging about it. They were saying, You know, they were trying to kill the saucer report. So the Army and Navy was engaged in this, what they called a concentrated campaign to stop the rumors. So that they were saying, we're debunking the saucers. I mean, they were very open about it. They weren't hiding it. So that's the Ramey Memo, and it's signed by Ramey. And I think the last part, the counterintelligence team was saying, we think we need to add visuals, okay, to just a simple a release saying that, oh, it's just a weather balloon isn't going to convince anybody. We think we need photos. So that's why Ramey had his weather balloon at his feet at that moment. This photo was taken, and then why they had the balloon demos afterwards. So that's the Ramey Memo, and it's a bit different from the modern Air Force story that, oh, it's just a mogul balloon, and, you know, and there weren't any bodies, and it's all exaggerated and made up. So that's that. Okay, one of the interesting things is we've been able to trace things that were happening back at the Pentagon, particularly with General Vandenberg. There isn't anything I've been able to find with Truman. It all looks very clean and sanitary. But there were things going on with Vandenberg which are very suspicious, although you can't point and say that's a smoking gun like I would call the Ramey Memo. Vandenberg's involvement, public involvement, from quotes in the newspaper, started on July 5th. The incident, with the press release on the base was July 8th, the afternoon. So Vandenberg is in Texas at that time, which I thought was a little suspicious, but I think he was just doing a political favor for a congressman. He's returning to Washington on July 5th, and he's asked about the flying saucers. And one woman says, are they Russians? Do the Russians have the secret of the flying saucer? And he says, well, we're looking into it. We've received thousands of inquiries. He says that. And we've been looking into it intensively since, I think he said July 2nd, maybe July 1st. So he admits that they're investigating. He doesn't say anything beyond that. Then he gets back to Washington, which would be, this was the weekend, July 5th. July 7th is Monday. And there he is in his log, which is in the Library of Congress. He's with General Curtis LeMay, who's the Deputy Director of Research and Development for the Army Air Force. And LeMay is briefing him on the flying discs because there's just all these reports in the newspapers, and the Pentagon is obviously getting flooded with phone calls about it. So Vandenberg is personally taking calls from a newspaper in Canada, asking what they are, and he's non-committal. There's a hoax disc story, crash disc story going on in Houston, where somebody claims to have found a disc and it has Army Air Force, printed on it. So he is personally spending a lot of time with LeMay trying to kill that story, and he's telling his people, he's calling his people in Houston and says, kill this story, do whatever you can to kill the story, which is itself kind of curious. And I sort of suspect that he already knew what was going on in Roswell, and he was afraid that might spread, and get the press curious at that time, and they were trying to contain it. What was going on in Roswell, according to the base public information officer Walter Hott, who in an affidavit that came out in 2007, he said that he was aware of them investigating this debris field northwest of town on July 7th when he got back to his office. But then later in the day, he heard that they had found a craft and body site north of town, closer into town, and had been discovered by civilians earlier that day. So back in Washington, Vandenberg has been informed of this, and so now they're really concerned. They have this craft and body site. We don't know exactly when, but so Vandenberg in the early afternoon is trying to kill this disc story down in Houston. And then at 2:30, he has a dental appointment, but he cancels it, and he goes out to the airport to personally greet the Army Air Force Secretary, Stuart Symington. And that is very peculiar because he's out of his office, according to his log, for an hour and a half. Why would he go out and personally greet and bring Symington back to the Pentagon. And I think that's because at that point he was aware of what was happening, the new things that were happening in Roswell, and it was urgent business. So it couldn't wait for Symington to get back. He had to talk to him immediately. So he comes back and he immediately goes into a meeting at the Pentagon with Symington. Just as he's getting back, Carl Hatch, who's one of the senators, or was it Dennis Chavez? I forget. It may have been Dennis Chavez. He calls Truman at the White House. Actually, his son calls for him, and he requests a special meeting with Truman, which does take place 2 days later, on July 9th in the morning. So what was that about? We don't know, because there's nothing in the Truman's logs or anything like that that says what the meeting was about. But it's just very curious. There are all these coincidences going on. That's the thing. There are just dozens of little coincidences like this. So Carl Hatch, or Dennis Chavez, is requesting this meeting with Truman. And then that's all we have for Vandenberg the next day. But the next morning is when things really are hopping. And then the public information officer, Walter Haut, says General Ramey had flown out to Roswell with his chief of staff, Colonel DuBose, who admitted that they staged a cover-up in Fort Worth. And there was a morning meeting at 7:30 that morning. And they're discussing the two crash sites. Debris is passed around for everybody to look at, and nobody knew what it was. And then General Ramey, they discuss whether the public should be told something, and Ramey says, no, we've decided to cover it up. And Walter Haut said, I think he was getting his orders from the Pentagon. So now what's interesting here is back in Washington at the Pentagon, General Vandenberg cancels a previously scheduled meeting, and he calls a 2.5-hour meeting. This is at exactly the same time as this morning meeting in Roswell. He calls a 2.5-hour meeting of the Joint Research and Development Board. And there's a whole backstory on the Joint Research and Development Board. This was it was chaired by Dr. Vannevar Bush of the Carnegie Institute, who'd been the nation's science, research, and development czar during World War II. He was one of the most important men in the government. And they did all the military, research and development during the war. And then the Defense Department, or the War Department, set up this Joint Research and Development Board afterwards to continue that. And so he's in charge of that. 2.5 years later, these Canadian documents were written by a Canadian radio engineer named Wilbert Smith, and also from the Canadian Embassy in Washington, talking about a super secret saucer study committee within the Research and Development Board, headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Okay, so this is the same group. The Joint Research and Development Board, 3 weeks later, with the passage of the National Security Act, became the Research and Development Board, and Bush was appointed the first chair of that. But he's still within the Research and Development Board in 1950, when this Wilbert Smith was given this briefing in Washington, saying the saucers are real, they're classified higher than the H-bomb, and this secret committee, headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush within the Research and Development Board, is looking into the modus operandi, how the saucers work, basically. And then it says, and they're also talking about mental aspects of the whole phenomenon, which is interesting. The Wilbert Smith memo, they mention these 4 things that he was briefed about, and then he says, there was also discussion about mental aspects of the flying saucers. And we don't know exactly what that means, but it could be referring to telepathic communications, which is very interesting because I've never seen that in any other document. Of the thousands of UFO documents, I've never seen that mentioned. But they were talking about this in 1950. As to the paper trail with Roswell, basically there is none. But that's in itself curious because this was a huge news story. Okay, it tied up the phone lines in the Pentagon for an entire afternoon and into the evening. They got probably thousands of phone calls. The newspapers mentioned the phone lines into New Mexico and Texas being tied up. So this was a huge news story. It was headline news. And yet there's no paper trail. You know, the Pentagon, it says Vandenberg right in the middle of this. This is about 45 minutes after the press release went out over the wire. He leaves his office. He goes to the Pentagon press room and personally handles the situation, directing calls to New Mexico and Texas. Now, okay, what's happening, guys? Like as if he didn't know. But he, you know, he's putting on a show. But you think Vandenberg would be very upset with this. You know, I had to disrupt my schedule to deal with a weather balloon. I mean, there would have been an investigation. How could you guys, you know, screw up that badly, misidentify a simple weather balloon? No investigation. There's no paper trail. The only government document that's ever been found on this was an FBI telegram that was written out of Dallas, where they're called by one of the intelligence people, you know, at Fort Worth, and they're said, oh, it's just a weather balloon and it's attached radar target. We're shipping it to Wright Field because phone conversations with them, they don't disagree. They disagree with the weather balloon story. They don't say why. They say, oh, we don't think it's a weather balloon. Well, that's because Colonel DuBose's chief of staff, I mean, not Colonel DuBose, but General Ramey's chief of staff, Colonel DuBose, told us that Washington ordered a special flight of debris flown probably on July 6th when the rancher reported the crash. They wanted this debris flown to Washington. It was a super secret shipment of debris, and then it was flown onto Wright Field. So they'd already seen the debris. And I think that's why the FBI is told, or they talked to Wright Field, and Wright Field told the FBI, we don't think it's a weather balloon. Okay, so they say that. And the other interesting thing is General Ramey said, oh, we've canceled the flight to Wright Field. It's just a weather balloon. But the FBI is saying, no, we're shipping it off to Wright Field, and Wright Field doesn't think it's a weather balloon.
My name is Stanton Friedman. I was a nuclear physicist for a number of years. I brought some strange qualifications to ufology. I worked on advanced propulsion systems so I could deal with the you can't get here from there kind of guys. I have had to think about all the why questions because I always get asked them, and people seem to find my answers edifying, if you will. I found that I had a good memory and could trust myself. And I find that I enjoy being on the stage. So you put them all together. And also, I was on a championship high school debating team. So it means you have to know both sides of the question. And it's much easier to handle the nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them, when you know their side as well as yours, and you know they haven't done their homework. I have yet to find a debunker who has done his homework. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to defend his position because there's plenty of data showing him he's full of baloney. So I take joy in that. I was the initial civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. It was totally by surprise. I mean, unexpected, so to speak. And I certainly didn't know when I had my first conversation with Jesse Marcel that 30 years later, I'd still be working on that case, you know. Or that Roswell would have a festival every year and so forth. I've enjoyed coming here. I enjoy the opportunity to answer people's questions. I found that fear of ridicule is one of the major human motivations. You want to avoid it. And so people are very pleased to get the chance to tell me about their experiences. They know I'm not going to laugh, and that pleases them. We all need to tell somebody, to justify ourselves maybe, whatever it is, but validate our self. So I've served that role for a long time. Also, I've found, somewhat to my surprise, that I became the champion for the downtrodden, so to speak. People enjoy when I'm on television and take on the noisy negativists, the debunkers, because not many people are willing to do it. So I feel an obligation to do that and to speak out. Now, I'm not saying everything in ufology is great, because it isn't. But I think we need to give credit where it's due and to encourage, especially younger people, to get involved. I mean, I'm an old man now, and I don't know how long I'll be here. We need other people to pick up the cudgel, so to speak, to hit the debunkers over the head and to go to the media. And I will expose the people on the pro side when they say things that are stupid or wrong. And I don't stick up for everything that says these things are real. There's a lot of guys saying things that simply aren't true. So I feel an obligation when I get asked to comment, when I get asked to appear, to do that, but to have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. Old habit from the debating days. After 51 years of study and investigation, I've reached 4 major conclusions about flying saucers. And I prefer the term flying saucers. Oh, why don't you say UFO? Because all flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. I'm interested in the flying saucers, not in the UFOs. Just like the basketball coach knows he wants a 7-footer. Don't tell him about all the midgets. Who cares? Give me the 7-footer. I want the flying saucer stories. Okay, 4 major conclusions. First, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline 28 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. Forget about it. Most isotopes aren't fissionable either, but you can build a nuclear reactor with the ones that are. Secondly, the subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate, meaning some few people within major governments have known since at least 1947 that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. I'm not saying everybody in the government knows. I worked under security. You don't keep secrets by telling everybody. You restrict the access as much as you possibly can. Need to know, compartmentalization, all this sort of thing. Third conclusion is that none of the arguments made against the first two by a small group of very noisy negativists, including my University of Chicago classmate, Carl Sagan, stand up under careful scrutiny. Oh, they sound splendid. But when you look at the data, Carl, for example, just to give an example of that, said there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting. Those are true statements. But there are no interesting and reliable sightings. That's totally false. Biggest study done for the United States Air Force. The better the quality of the sighting, the higher the reliability. The more likely to be unexplainable. That's a fact. So none of those arguments stand up. And finally, the fourth conclusion, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, bodies and wreckage, obviously, for 62 years. Simply put, in July 1947, about roughly 2 weeks after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting, where he saw 9 objects, he wasn't talking alien spacecraft, thought they were a secret government project, but they sure didn't look like any airplanes he saw. And he was a trusted pilot, and he reported, and this got a lot of headlines. And then suddenly there were lots of sightings by lots of people. We know of over 2,000 in the next couple of weeks. And so suddenly people were seeing these strange craft in the skies. And if you look at the newspapers for the weekend of July 4th, 1947, they're just loaded with UFO stories. They didn't call them UFOs, flying discs, flying saucers, whatever. And then comes Roswell. And so what apparently happened is that a saucer bit the dirt out at the Brazil Ranch, probably the 3rd or so of July. The rancher heard a big explosion at night. It was a very bad storm, and he didn't think it was thunder. I've been here in storms. I had my car pelted with hailstones, making a mess out of my car, lightning and so forth. They're powerful storms, the water from the Gulf and the air from the west, and whammo. Anyway, the next day he goes out to check on his stock. Water is a major concern here. He was a sheep rancher, as it happens. And he finds this area, he was on horseback, finds this area covered, strewn with lots of pieces of very strange material, like nothing he'd ever seen before. And we're talking half-mile to a mile long area, hundreds of yards wide, and all this weird stuff out in the middle of nowhere. Now, his concern was that the sheep didn't seem to want to cross the debris field. You've got to get them to water. Because, as I say, water is the big thing out here. In the summer, it gets over 100 degrees, and usually there's no rain for long periods of time. What rain that does come evaporates quickly. So you need to be able to know what's going on with your stock, or you're going to lose them. So on the 5th of July, we know that he went into the little town of Corona. This is about more than 75 miles northwest of Roswell. People say, what happened at Roswell? Nothing. This was out in the boonies. He goes into the store where he does his normal shopping. He brings some of the wreckage with him. They pass it around at the bar. And he's complaining because who's going to clean up the mess? That's what his concern is. Now, remember, he didn't have electricity. He didn't have a telephone. He heard nothing about flying saucers, flying discs, whatever you want to call them. The people at the store had heard about it, made the news, big time. And there were articles saying that there were rewards being offered for pieces of one of these flying discs, flying saucers, whatever it was. And they were the people who suggested he ought to go into the sheriff's office in Roswell with some of that stuff, and maybe he could collect a reward. They were talking a few $1,000s, which was a lot of money at that time. So dutifully, on Sunday the 6th, he goes the long way into Roswell. He's 10 miles from a road. He's out in the back country. There are no stores. There's no nothing, literally. I took some Japanese reporters out there one time, and we didn't see another person or a vehicle for 54 miles. This is not highly populated. There's no tourists out there, you know. Anyway, he comes in the sheriff's office, shows the sheriff some of this stuff, talks about the reward and stuff. And the sheriff, by prearrangement, called the base, the Roswell Army Airfield, home of the most elite military group in the entire world, the 509th. I say that because they dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped 2 bombs during Operation Crossroads in the Pacific in 1946. Hand-picked officers, hand-picked men, high security. These were the guys. Nobody else had ever dropped an atomic bomb, you understand. So, you know. Prearrangement with the base was that anything that might affect the base in one way or another, a drunken airman having a bad accident, a woman saying she was raped by one of the airmen, all of these things, they wanted to be notified. They wanted good relationships with the town. The town only had about 25,000 people in. The base had a few thousand people. So he happens to get Major Jesse Marcel. The intelligence officer for the base was the duty officer on that Sunday. He checks things out. The sheriff tells him there's a rancher here with this weird stuff. Jesse checks it out, talks to Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, and Jesse tells him didn't see anything conventional. Don't know what it was. So Colonel Blanchard says, because the rancher had said there's lots of this stuff out there, this is kind of crazy. What's going on here? He knew he hadn't lost any airplanes. It wasn't one of his. Tells Jesse to take a counterintelligence corps guy out with him. That's important because the big concern was who's trying to spy on us. New Mexico had more classified work going on per capita than any other place. 2 nuclear weapons labs here. All the missiles being fired over at the White Sands Missile Range. The biggest employer in the state at the time was Kirtland Air Force Base. So if you're going to be a foreign country like the Soviet Union and you want to spy on the United States to see what's going on technologically, New Mexico's the place. So Colonel Blanchard was being sensible. And there's no way you could tell anybody how to get to the site. No GPS back then. You know, people said, why did they plug in the coordinates? Well, they couldn't. So they followed the rancher out. Got there fairly late in the day, had their sleeping bags, stayed overnight, and the rancher gave him a can of beans. I got that from Jesse Marcel later. I was the first to talk to him. And the next day they go out to the debris field. And Jesse is puzzled. Here's all this stuff, almost a mile long, hundreds of yards wide, and this weird materials, but nothing conventional, and no crater. When an airplane goes in, it makes a pretty big hole in the ground. When I say conventional, I mean no nuts, bolts, rivets, propellers, wires, vacuum tubes, tags saying made in Oshkosh. You know, there was nothing like that. So they picked up as much as they could, put it in their 2 vehicles, and went back to Roswell. Jesse stops at his home, which is on the way between out there and the base, shows his 11-year-old son, who is now a medical doctor, a flight surgeon, a colonel, a very special guy, pilot. And in the morning goes into the base and brings his stuff to the meeting there. And the colonel has to decide what to do, and his choice is he gives 2 orders which impact on the story. One is to Walter Haught, the base public information officer, put out a press release saying we've recovered one of these flying discs that people have been talking about. The other is to Jesse. Take one of our B-29s to take you and the wreckage to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is the place you normally send captured enemy equipment to figure out what the heck is it, how does it work, etc. But make a stop at our headquarters, 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas. If you look at a map, it's right on the way. So everybody follows orders. For people who say, why didn't they argue? Come on, this is 2 years after the end of the war. The boss talks, you do. I mean, there's no arguing. And by the time Jesse gets to Fort Worth, it's over an hour flight from here, the general, Roger Ramey, his staff officer, then Colonel Thomas Jefferson Dubose, has taken a call from Ramey's boss, General McMullen in Washington. Again, it's all chain of command kind of stuff. Blanchard reports to Ramey, Ramey reports to McMullen. These guys knew each other. They were West Pointers, McMullen and Dubose and Ramey and Blanchard. And I got this straight from Colonel Dubose, retired general when I found him, incidentally, that McMullen tells him 3 things. I want you to get the press off our back. I don't care how you do it. See, Walter Haught had been told to put out a press release. He did it, naturally. Made it all over the place. Second is, send some of that wreckage up here today with one of your Colonel Couriers. Third, I don't want you to talk about it ever again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing, Colonel? No, sir. When a 2-star general tells a colonel what to do, he does it. And they knew each other, so there was no question of who is this guy. So when Jesse arrives, General Ramey says, you don't say anything. I'll take care of it. So pictures are taken, and there's Jesse stuck with this phony wreckage, which isn't what he brought in. It's radar reflector, weather balloon junk, which were used all the time. And Jesse couldn't say anything. Press there. General Ramey puts out a press release. Mistake made. Not a flying saucer. And the headline in some papers was, Ramey empties Roswell saucer. Now, what's interesting is the original press release went out after noon. That means it was too late for all the East Coast papers and too late for the morning papers across the country because of the time zones. But not too late for evening papers from Chicago West. I say that because some people think it only appeared in the Roswell Daily Record. Big deal, you know. It was in the Chicago Daily News, front page of the Sacramento Bee, front page of the San Francisco paper. Los Angeles Herald Express, full width, Army captures flying saucer. Because of the time zones again, General thinks it's radar, weather, gadget. Same day, taken care of very effectively. The next morning's paper all have Ramey empties Roswell saucer. And that's what the story most people saw, so no big deal. False alarm, don't worry about it. We thought we had one, we don't, forget it. So that just sat there. Now, what happened back home here, of course, is that while Marcel was off to Texas, naturally the colonel took other measures. First thing you'd do, it'd be to go out to the ranch with a small plane and look around, see what else you can find. This is desert country, no big trees or anything. You'd immediately spot any metallic stuff. There's great visibility out there. And then you'd make plans accordingly to send troops out. Like I said, there's no tourist stuff out there. There's nothing. Mother Nature, period. End of report. I believe at that time they spotted what I'll call the crew compartment with bodies in it, 2.5 miles from where the wreckage was, primarily. Now, Marcel has nothing to do with this. He's gone over to Texas. And they send troops out to recover the wreckage as much as you can. And the bodies was a separate question, of course. They had plenty of troops, and they had other people to call on all across the state. Fort Bragg, not Bragg, Bliss, down south of here, up at Kirtland, over at Alamogordo. There's plenty of troops to be called in. And so they proceed doing their thing. And they'd grab the rancher right away, fed him a news story, and he talks to the press. And, oh, well, it was just a mistake. And he admits he had recovered balloons before. And if he ever recovers one again, he's never going to say anything to anybody, basically. And apparently he was kept at the base for several days. His closest neighbors, 10 miles away, the Proctor family. One of them, the man, Floyd Proctor, saw him in town with these military guys, and he didn't even say hi. Now, the ranchers were friendly to each other. This is an interesting community out here. They depend on each other. You need help, you're guaranteed to get it from your neighbors or whatever. You need a place to stay when there's a bad storm, you're guaranteed to get it. You know, this is not New York, where the people in the apartment building don't know who lives down the hall kind of thing. And so that was very strange. Okay, what went on after that? Apparently there was a major effort to recover as much wreckage as possible, troops going fingertip to fingertip, and then back, picking up all the pieces of this stuff. Talked to one soldier who'd been there. He'd pick up this stuff. It was peculiar, the foil-like material, because it was memory metal. You could crumple it and fold it and fold it and fold it, and it would unfold on its own. He said you'd pick it up, stick it in his gunny sack, burlap bag, and by the time it hit the bottom, it had already expanded out to look the same as it had before, and with no marks on it or anything like that. So all this was going on, and it's easy to hide out here. There's nothing there. There's no tourists driving by, you know. And apparently tents were set up, bodies were photographed. And people have to understand, when you have an aircraft accident, alien or not, you need to get some idea of what happened in situ. Where are the things with relation to other things? When an airplane crashes, you know, with the rudders this way or that way, all kinds of stuff. You don't just grab everything you can and get the heck out of it. There's no rush. No tourists. You put up a perimeter and you don't let anybody in, but there's nobody there. And it's not on a road. It's important for people to recognize. I had a reporter demand of me, well, why don't you just go up and park your car along the road there and go into the metal detector and find wreckage? And I said, there's no road. What do you mean there's no road? Of course there's a road. There's no road. It's 10 miles from the road. This is New Mexico. This person called me from England, so finally I said, look, you had 50 million people, England and Wales at that time. New Mexico had 1 million. But New Mexico is twice the size of England and Wales combined. 100 times the population density. It's a very, very different world. So the Roswell mystery has gone on. Now, we don't know what all the government did. We don't have any classified reports. We do know, having worked under security, I can say this. When you're faced with a situation like that, a couple of important points. You're going to get as much help as you can, as quickly as you can, from people who have appropriate clearances and appropriate competence. There's plenty of competence here in New Mexico. Los Alamos labs, one of the finest labs in the world. Sandia, on bodies and biological stuff. The Lovelace clinic outfit had government contracts to do classified work, biological work. So they had the competence. The head of the Lovelace clinic was chairman of the Aviation Biology Committee at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So you know who to go to, and you take action now. And so what you do later is another story. But you have to find out what's going on. Because there were some obvious questions. What is going on? Are these potential invaders? Are they going to destroy us? Are they out to attack us? Are they working with anybody on this planet? It's perfectly obvious, if you look at all the good stories, that these things had flight competence that was well beyond anything we have. That's why you'd be worried. You certainly couldn't go public. This is 2 years after the war. Half of Europe was starving. The Marshall Plan went into effect at this time. You could hardly say to the world, oh, we thought you'd like to know. You know, there are these alien spacecraft flying above our territory. We can't do a darn thing about it. We don't know what they want, where they're from, or how they operate, but we thought you'd like to know. Totally destabilizing at that time. and justifiably so. They shouldn't go public. That they pulled a fast one on the... Pulling fast ones in New Mexico is nothing new. When the first atom bomb was tested, very successful, it was seen from 100 miles away. There were people up at 5:30 in the morning who saw it. Spectacular. A second sun, somebody said. Well, there were calls to sheriff's offices all over the state. You know, what happened? Well, finally, after a few days, they put out a press release. An ammunition dump had blown up, and fortunately, nobody was injured. This was after the July 16th explosion of our first atomic bomb. Now, after the August 6th and 9th, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then it was announced what that was the first tested one. I don't blame them for lying. Disinformation, misinformation, important part of military tactics. And we used a lot of it during World War II, intentionally. And I'm not saying that's wrong. The question now is, shouldn't we be told more than we have been told? Should people be exposed to ridicule? Now, why would they keep the secret? People keep asking me that. Well, why don't they tell us what they know? You want to figure out how the darn things work. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. You got wreckage. You set up your secret project. Rule number one for security, always, you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. They listen to the radio too. Didn't watch television back then, but they read the newspapers, you know. Second problem, what if the other guy figures out how they work before you do? And everybody's got another guy, you know, India and Pakistan, us and the Russians, and there's a whole bunch of these, North and South Korea, whatever. And you don't want them to know, you know, they know. Because weapon, counter-weapon, counter-counter-weapon, it's an old game that's been played for a long time. The third problem, if there were to be an announcement made by highly trusted individuals around the world, not easy to find any, you understand. My favorite choice is the Queen and the Pope, saying, indeed, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. What would happen? Church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, the stock market would go down, anything that's, you don't know what's going to happen. But I think another thing that would happen, based on 600 college lectures, is that the younger generation, which unlike me was never alive when there wasn't a space program, would immediately push for a new view of ourselves, instead of Americans, Canadians, Greeks, Chinese, Peruvians, whatever, as Earthlings. Obviously, from an alien viewpoint, we are all Earthlings. We don't seem to like that very much, but that's the way it is. And you know what? No government that I'm aware of wants its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet instead of that individual government. Nationalism's the only game in town, and you don't need to look far to see that. There's a fourth problem. Some fundamentalist religious groups have loudly maintained that we are the only intelligent life in the universe. Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell took this attitude, that this is the work of the devil. And I think that's an insult to the great glory of God, that this is the best she can do, frankly. You know, we killed 50 million during the war, destroyed 1,700 cities. What kind of a civilization is this, for goodness sakes? So there's a fifth reason, technology from a different viewpoint. People have said to me, Stan, look, if their aliens are coming here and we're not going there, that means they're more advanced than we are. That seems reasonable. But that means that soon there'll be new methods of energy production. There goes the oil business. New methods of ground and air transport. There goes the car and plane business. New methods of computers and communication. Economic chaos. Who wants that? You know. And there's a sixth reason, too. I have, over the years, because of the lecturing, because people feel it's safe to talk to me, and they got to tell somebody, heard 7 different instances of planes going up after UFOs and not coming back. We've never told families that. And people say, come on, Stan, you think they wouldn't tell the mother of a soldier why he isn't coming home? Yeah, I'd say they wouldn't. We have good precedent for that. Good precedent for a lousy thing. There's a book by a man named William Burroughs called By Any Means Necessary, dealing with the fate of 166 military crew members of reconnaissance planes that were tickling the radar at North Korea, Russia, and China after the war mostly, but even later. You come in as quickly as you can and see how quickly their radar comes on. These are loaded reconnaissance planes, loaded with instrumentation. Some of these got shot down. We did go past the 12-mile limit kind of thing. Nobody was told anything. Unfortunate accident, plane lost at sea. Sorry about that. In 2001, more than 50 years after some of these events took place, the government had a conference. They brought in the families, gave them the medals, and told them what happened to their sons, fathers, brothers, whatever. 166 people. This is our government that withheld the truth from the families. So if they got shot down by UFOs, they weren't about to be told that. And if you told public, maybe pilots wouldn't want to fly after them either. So it's a complicated question, this whole business. We don't know all there is to know. I don't get classified reports from the government. I did when I worked in industry, but not about UFOs. So what's really needed here is an effort similar to that was used to uncover the political Watergate. Washington Post, they had a lot of backing from the newspapers, Bernstein, Woodward and Bernstein, follow the money and all this kind of stuff. They have spent essentially nothing on looking into the truth about flying saucers. Part of it is arrogance. We take great pride in printing all that's fit to print, says the New York Times. If this were real, it would be important. Everybody agrees with that. No argument there. But if we're important, I would know about it because I keep track of what's important, and I don't, so it must not be, and I'm not going to waste my time. That's circular reasoning. There can't be anything. If there were, I would know. I don't, so I'm not going to look. That guarantees you're not going to find out anything. That's a terrible situation. And I can understand people in power wanting to stay in power. It comes with the territory. But as a nuclear guy, I think the biggest threat to my great-grandson's future is nuclear proliferation. And if I can do anything to get people to take the steps that are needed to cut down the likelihood of that, and one of the biggest would be to recognize that we're all earthlings. To me, it seems crazy. The military budget in the United States this year will be something over $600 billion. The rest of the world, roughly another $500 million. We don't know the exact numbers. And yet, every single day of the year, 30,000 children die needlessly of preventable disease and starvation. Now, those are two sets of statistics that don't make any sense when put together. Why is it more important to build planes, guns, explosives, nuclear weapons, whatever, than it is to feed the kids? What do aliens think about us? And I give an example to people. We figured out how the star works, how all the stars work. The process is nuclear fusion. We figured that out in 1938 on paper. Brilliant physicist from Cornell. Okay, in 1952, we put it to use. We exploded our first hydrogen bomb. How big was it? Well, the equivalent of exploding 10 million tons of TNT. 10 million tons. The fireball was 3 miles wide. Now, what do you suppose the aliens thought about that? What's with these idiots, I think, would be one thing. And remember, the nuclear proliferation has gone all over the place. Not just us, and then Russia, and France, and Britain, and now we got North Korea, Pakistan, India, maybe Iran coming up. So what I'm saying is, recognizing that we're not the big shots we'd like to think we are, that maybe the public needs to know that we're not at the top of the mountain in the local neighborhood. Maybe that would get us to wise up. And I think that's important. Yeah, I wrote the foreword and the epilogue for Shoot Them Down. Frank Ficino had come to me. We'd met at a meeting in Gulf Breeze, Florida. He told me he was working on the Flatwoods case. And I did some checking, and it was an interesting case. And then he asked me to be a speaker at the 50th anniversary celebration. This was September 1952, so 2002, September 12th. I did a lot more checking, and I decided to go there. I found it to be an interesting case. We visited the actual location. I gave a talk. I talked to the primary witnesses and stuff. I was very impressed with how much work Frank had done. But he hadn't said anything outside about it, so I was encouraging him to speak out, write it up, talk about it. And he's done all of that. You see, he had done some very special things. He had an interview with Colonel Dale Levitt of the National Guard, which nobody else had gotten to talk. He led the West Virginia National Guard, and he had troops out there at the Flatwood case site, came in the back way, so to speak, recovered some strange stuff, never talked about it, but he opened up to Frank after several attempts, but finally. Frank had also talked to the reporter who had been the chief reporter in town at the Braxton County newspaper, had talked to the family of the main witnesses and others, and had been with them on We the People television program. And Frank had gotten him to open up. So he had dug out an awful lot of stuff. And he got the Blue Book files and did a lot of checking around. So I encouraged him, gave him some clues as to how you get more information and all the rest of that, and was delighted to see that he'd finally put together a book. And so I wrote the foreword and the epilogue. And I was again at another conference in Flatwoods. And I think it's an important book because it was expanded from merely the Flatwoods story, which is exciting enough. But we found out that over 200 fatal military plane crashes had occurred, according to the New York Times, which means there were probably more that they didn't know about, between 1951 and 1956. 200. These are fatal ones. This isn't just plain old accidents. This is where pilots were killed. And we found out that 5 of those pilots had over 100 missions in Korea. That means they're pretty good pilots because there were MiGs trying to shoot them down. And so they leave Korea, they come back to the United States, and they have an accident, a fatal accident. That seems a little strange. 1 maybe, 2, but 5? And the New York Times, in several instances, used words like disintegrated and disappeared. What's that supposed to mean with regard to a plane accident, you know? So Frank has put together a tremendous amount of stuff in the book. It should be looked at by everybody to know what was really going on. In other words, I think we're talking the tip of the iceberg. These orders to shoot them down. We have proof of that. And we have the head of the American Rocket Society, a man named Farnsworth, writing President Truman, thinking that was not such a good idea to shoot them down, put out those orders. Furthermore, we have these stories that I noted to Frank about pilots going up to chase UFOs and not coming back. We even have General Roger Ramey, who was so involved with the Roswell stuff. He'd got another star, was one of their experts. 52 was the big year over Washington, D.C. And we have him admitting that they scrambled jets hundreds of times, just routine. But if they're no threat to the security of the United States, which is the constant claim, so why are you chasing them and why are you telling pilots to shoot them down, you know? So there's a lot more going on here that we don't know about, just like from the intelligence agencies. I can guarantee you a laugh from an audience when I show the blacked out CIA UFO documents that it took me 5 years to get and that you can read 8 words on a page. By their definition, they're UFO documents, you understand. The NSA, National Security Agency, no such agency is the inside joke, you know, or NSA never says anything. Got 160 pages, 156 pages of NSA UFO stuff. You can read 1 sentence per page. All the rest is supposedly sources and methods information. 97% sources and methods and only 3% UFOs. That makes no sense at all. So the book is an important milestone in comprehensive research, talking to people, finding documents, and putting it all together in a way that makes sense. So I think he's done a splendid job. Got a couple more books coming out. His investigation of Flatwoods will be a separate book. People are all aware in ufology that 1952 was the big year with all the sightings over Washington. But they weren't involved or weren't aware of the whole story the way Frank has brought it out. So we need more people to do the kind of research that Frank did. There are 4 rules for debunkers. This applies in many other fields besides ufology, but it's important to recognize these because the tactics are pretty obvious once you start looking for them. 1, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. So you won't find the largest study of UFOs ever done for the United States Air Force referenced in the writings of the noisy negativists. It's as if they didn't exist. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's not science. It's pseudoscience. 3rd, the rule is if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's a lot easier and nobody will know the difference anyway. And this applies to ghosts and all kinds of other stuff, where you can't bring a body into court, so to speak. And 4th, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and again, nobody will know the difference. So we hear the SETI guys, SETI, supposed to stand for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, really stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. There is no evidence for UFOs. But they never reference the large-scale scientific studies. What they mean is they're not going to look for it, and if they see it, they're not going to mention it. Because who needs SETI, radio telescope searches, if aliens are visiting? Maybe you need to learn sign language for communication, So I've intrigued a lot of people with those 4 rules because people with other interests besides UFOs, oh yeah, that's the way those guys are. So it's important that you recognize the tactics of your enemies. I consider them enemies because the way of science is to have facts and data first, conclusions later, not start with conclusions and forget about the facts. And we need to protect ourselves against this kind of idiocy. Another part of the problem is the fact that you will hear over and over again false proclamations about who believes in flying saucers, as if nobody does. Only kooks and quacks and little old ladies in tennis shoes. Friedman, you're the only scientist who says they're real, which isn't true. But there are opinion polls out there. I have a chapter in my book, Flying Saucers and Science, reviewing polls, including of engineers and scientists, the general public, the different ways of conducting polls. And there are more believers than non-believers. But most people think most people don't believe, so they don't report what they see. They won't sponsor a thesis project. There have only been a dozen or so. There's room for 30 or 40. So the mythology controls how people react. And that's unfortunate. I had a class of 100 students. I said, I want to get your personal opinion about certain things, but I don't want you to be influenced by your neighbors in the classroom here, about 100 students. I want you to vote with your eyes closed. Your professor and I will count the votes. To make a long story short, it turns out 80% thought most people didn't believe in UFOs. 80% of that group did believe in UFOs. That's an enormous dichotomy. But their actions are determined by their perception of how other people will respond. And when I talk to people about their sightings, I check all my audiences at the end of my lecture, never at the beginning. Typically, 10% will admit that they had a sighting. The hands go up reluctantly at first, and then by the time I point and count, by the time I get over the other side of the hall, 10%, that's a lot. Each one thinks he's the only one, you see. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. When people tell me about their sightings, which they want to do, they got to tell somebody who's not going to laugh at them. Did you report it? No. Why not? They think I was some kind of a nut. So fear of ridicule is the dominant thing. And part of that's been created by the failure of the scientific community, the journalistic community, and some of the things that the government has done. So what difference does it make? So they're real. So who cares? So what? And my answers are that one of the primary things is when you recognize the planet's being visited is first, it takes man out of the center of the universe. Remember, Copernicus had the gall to suggest the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. The sun was. One little step over. The book was banned for 300 years by the church. They got over it after a while. Flying saucers finished the job that Copernicus started of taking man out of the center of the universe. You see, you can always justify your behavior if you say, hey, we're at the top of the mountain. We're the best there is. It's okay. the old Robert Burns notion of to see ourselves as others see us. I kind of hammer on people the fact that our primitive society has a major activity, tribal warfare. Many young people don't realize that we killed 50 million of our own kind during World War II. We destroyed 1,700 cities. How does that look to somebody out there who's a little more advanced than we are? We're not nice guys. We're wasting the resources of the planet on killing. We don't feed our poor and starving. We build more bombs, more airplanes to destroy people with. So the whole point here, and I'm not trying to upset anybody's religion, although it might give us a chance to think about what that means. Did the God create them? Or is this all there is? If you say this isn't all there is, then you have to say, well, where do we fit in the scheme of things? We don't have a good track record. Now, admittedly, there were plenty of people who thought Bishop Ussher was right. The world was created in 4004 BC on a Thursday afternoon in October. That's only 6,000 years ago, so we know what's gone on. Well, if you say it was 4 billion years ago, that changes the picture. And if you allow for there being much more advanced civilizations than ours, I mean, just down the street, 39 light years away, there are two sun-like stars. They're only an eighth of a light year apart from each other, but are a cool billion years older than the sun. Let's hope that with a little head start, you might develop wisdom. You might develop a better way of doing it. I don't mean they're going to come here and save us. I think they want to save themselves from us. But I'm saying it gives hope for the future that somebody got through this stage where we're out of too much technology and not enough sociology, where we're building too many bombs and not feeding enough starving people. So it forces us to rethink our relationship to the neighborhood, if not the universe. I don't worry about the universe. Within 50 light years is far enough out for me. But when you see how big a variation there is in the ages of the stars in the neighborhood and how close they have another neighbor, these two stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, not only are a billion years older than the sun, which is quite a bit, but they're only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 35 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. That means from a planet around one, the other star is visible all day long, which is quite remarkable. And you could directly observe planets around the other star and know that there's life there. So you might expect colonization, migration, all this kind of thing. But maybe you could find out how it is they got through this stage of too much technology, not enough sociology. I mean, I jokingly say sometime, maybe the reason we're so primitive is that this is the devil's island of this corner of the galaxy. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. And people laugh, and I say, remember, Australia got founded by convicts, and they're proud of it. And Georgia did too. They're not so proud of it. But so what I'm saying is we need a totally new perspective. We need to wake up and see what's really happening in the world around us. Then there'll be some hope for my great-grandson.